President Trump has reportedly approved plans to attack Iran, but has not made a final decision on whether to strike the country.
It comes as the Foreign Secretary heads to Washington for talks with his US counterparts. Shadow Foreign Secretary Dame Priti Patel joins us now. Thank you for joining us this morning, Priti Patel, on Good Morning Britain. If Keir Starmer was to get a call from Donald Trump or even from the Foreign Secretaries out in Washington at the moment asking the UK to join the military fight, would you agree with that?
Well, I think, first of all, it's important to put all this into the context of decision-making in terms of what that would be based on. You know, having been in government, there's a lot of work that takes place. But absolutely, while we want peace in the region, we're crystal clear that Iran should not be able to obtain nuclear weapons. And if the government judges that such action is necessary to avoid that, then we would absolutely support the government if it deemed it necessary to ensure that we can defend our country, our citizens, and effectively a lot of our strategic equities in the Middle East region. And as you and your reporters are aware, they're very significant.
Would you support them without a vote in Parliament first?
Well, I think there are ways in which we as an opposition would be able to hold the government to account in Parliament, you know, without a vote in Parliament. So just to give an example, there are avenues of communications between the government and the opposition. I've been there myself when I was in government in terms of briefings that take place to opposition ministers and leaders. We'd obviously have to be part of those dialogues and conversations, because whenever it comes to operations, military operations, tactical operations, strategic operations, time is of the essence. So there doesn't become a debating point. So we would hold the government to account in Parliament in the normal way for their actions. But I think, you know, if there was a pressing moment, you know, in the next few days, and we would clearly, through our dialogues and discussions, support the government in their actions if they felt that it was absolutely necessary to keep our country safe.
Would you understand if they didn't, though? Because it wasn't long ago, of course, that the UK government made sanctions against two ministers in the Israeli government, have spoken very strongly about some of the actions of the Israeli government, blocking aid and the killing of innocent civilians. The Israeli government faces charges by some people of genocide. Would you agree if the UK government decided on that basis that they can't get involved because the Attorney General has said any offensive action would actually be illegal?
Well, the answer to that is no. And this is because this isn't about Israel. This is actually about Iran. Iran sponsors and bankrolls terrorism, and they're directly responsible for the bloodshed in the conflict in the Middle East. They sponsor Hamas, the Houthis, and Hezbollah. And let's not forget, we have Iranian agents active in the US. I'm a former Home Secretary, so I'm pretty well aware of some of the national security state threats implications here. And that is why we've always worked with not just Israel, but other allies and counterparts, including the United States of America and Five Eyes colleagues, in terms of, you know, making sure that we are protected against Iranian threats. And I should just explain that it's both on nuclear capabilities, but also ballistic missiles. They have missile capability that would threaten Europe. And we should remember that that's stockpile on nuclear has increased in recent months. They have enough enriched uranium for at least 9 atomic bombs. This is not something that we can, you know, look at lightly anymore.
But actually, it was an Israeli minister, wasn't it? It was the Minister of Heritage, Eliyahu, who was actually threatened to use nuclear weapons on Gaza. So you're right to question the nuclear weapon capability of Iran. Of course, we want to know that, but we don't know what Israel have. They have this policy of ambiguity, and we don't know what they have.
Well,
yet
actually,
we do know that their ministers threaten Gaza with nuclear weapons.
Well, that is not the point right now. I think, you know, the operation of Israel in terms of the strikes against Iran, as of the 13th of June last Friday, they have been clear that their purpose of their operation was to degrade Iran's nuclear capabilities on the basis, and I think this is really important, talks and dialogues have been in place. The United States of America have led those talks, and they've been successful in bringing Iran to the negotiating table. However, while those talks were taking place, the good faith of those talks were undermined because the IAEA, their own reports demonstrated and proved last week that Iran had more enriched nuclear capabilities and materials that they needed for civilian purposes. And that is effectively why, the timings are now and why this has come to a real head. And I think you have to look at many of the comments from President Trump overnight as to the balance of judgment that he is now exercising, because Iran is a threat to all of us. They're clear about Israel.
Just need to clarify, the IAEA report concluded that there was no systematic proof of a nuclear weapon program coming out of Iran. That did come out of the report.
Look, you say there's been war of words overnight. There's been more attacks overnight as well. The US is evacuating its citizens. The UK has withdrawn family members of British Embassy staff. At what point do you think we should be, much more intentionally getting British people out?
Well, there are thousands upon thousands of British nationals in Israel. And to be candid, the Foreign Office, actually has a good approach in terms of evacuating British nationals and offering repatriation because they've done this previously. I think the current government's response is not sufficient. And if families of embassy staff and personnel are being evacuated, then I think the same facilities must be extended to our citizens. Even America, they're obviously looking at doing this. They've spoken about air, land or sea. I think the government really urgently does need to step up and put the facilities in place now, because this is a very, very precarious time. We know what's going on. All the media reports are reporting day in, day out on attacks in Israel, and where there are British nationals there, and the responsibility of the British government is obviously to protect British nationals, both at home and abroad.
Can we ask you about the grooming report and this national inquiry that's going to be taking place in sexual abuse across all group forms of sexual abuse, actually? Now, you were Home Secretary for a long time while this was happening and when these stories were revealed, going back to 2010. One of the things that Baroness Casey has said that actually a lot of this has been politicised. It's been used by politicians for their own gain, and actually, as a result of that, there's been either institutional rape, people become worried about institutional racism or political correctness, etc. And therefore, by making this into a political issue, you actually don't end up solving the issue and actually looking at the causes of it. Do you feel responsible for some of that?
Well, I don't, and I'll explain to you why I don't. Because when I was Home Secretary, I was working with our National Crime Agency on particular operations that I can't speak about publicly. And I actually worked with the Member of Parliament for Rotherham on a lot of the cases that were taking place in our own constituency. What I found very challenging, and I think everyone will speak to this, and I think Louise Casey, Baroness Casey, has said this in her report as well, was just the level of deniability of institutions of the state. And this does come back to why we need the inquiry. It's institutional failure, state cover-up, ranging from local authorities that were granting taxi licences to paedophiles, abusers of young girls, and even shop licences and restaurant licences. We saw so much of that, and a lot of that was under investigation. I would also just like to make the point, I set up something called the External Reference Group during my time as Home Secretary. And these groups are really important because it was all about looking at the characteristics of the offenders, looking at the data, the background, and also the scope of all of this across the country. Now, I was not involved in politicising any of this at all because of the level of seriousness on this. All I wanted was prosecutions, and that's the reason why we put the resources into police and the National Crime Agency to undertake the investigations. And if I may say so, I was involved in many legal challenges at the time where we found it difficult to remove from the United Kingdom many of the foreign nationals that had been involved in some of the most abhorrent abuse of young girls.
But can I just say, but on the data, one thing Baroness Casey does say that we're dealing with only 34%. So only 34% of suspects' ethnicity was ever recorded, yet judgments were made by previous governments. That's a really small sample. Why wasn't more data collected? Why did you make those assumptions, those decisions, on just 34%? You knew that. That was apparent at the time.
I can't speak for that around, I can speak for my time and the work that we did with the external reference group and the work that we undertook in terms of looking at the characteristics of offenders. This has been happening over decades, and that is the shameful and the most appalling aspect of all of this. And quite frankly, I think, this also, look at the way data has been recorded, how you change data recording mechanisms over many years, governments and decades. This has to be looked at. This public inquiry, I think, is absolutely essential. There'll be many aspects of institutional state failure that will be put out in the public domain, and I think we all need to have that scrutiny for the victims of these awful crimes, but actually for the state to put its hands up and say, there are many things that they got wrong and they should have been doing much more, and we've got to learn from that and absolutely change the basics, as you've just said, on recording data, and also looking at the prosecutions, the criminal justice system, the way local authorities, policing, the whole state, social services, every element of the state has interacted on this.
All right. Shadow Foreign Secretary Dame Priti Patel, we thank you very much for joining us this morning on Good Morning Britain.